My grandfather sailed by steamship from India to California in 1913, so my family is celebrating 100 years in America this year. My grandfather farmed the land in the Central Valley. He endured, survived race riots, laws that prevented him from becoming a citizen, from owning land for decades. Yet somehow that never crushed his love for America or for his neighbors. I remember when World War II happened, my parents told me stories about how my grandfather looked after the farms of Japanese Americans who were rounded up and interned in concentration camps. My grandfather was only a farmer, but to me he showed me how to live, that we ought to live not just for ourselves and our own families, but for others, that we ought to fight for others. And so I think that legacy was passed down to me as I began my journey as a Sikh American devoted to social justice, and not just for my community, but for all people in America. On September 11th, 2001, I remember I was a college student. I was 20 years old, watching the towers fall over and over again, and then the image of a bearded and turbaned Osama bin Laden. And it was just moments before I realized that America's new enemy looked like my grandfather, looked like my family. And even though my family had lived in the United States for decades, in that instant, people who wore turbans and beards, Sikh Americans, Muslim Arab Americans, other Americans, became automatically suspect, perpetually foreign, and potentially terrorist in the eyes of their neighbors. And it was just moments after that we started hearing news of hate crimes break out on city streets across America. Balbir Singh Sodhi was a Sikh American who was murdered on September 15th in Mesa, Arizona. He was the first of at least several dozen people murdered in the year-long aftermath of 9/11. In the years after September 11th, we saw that hate crimes, violent hate crimes, decreased, but racism showed up in other aspects of social life. It showed up when Sikh men and boys were searched twice, 3 times, 4 times at our airports. It showed up when Sikh children began to experience bullying in the schoolyard. It showed up when Sikhs have been declined employment and faced discrimination in the workplace. It showed up in racial slurs that have become a common day occurrence for Sikh Americans who wear turbans walking down our city streets. And so I think that in the years after September 11th, the tragedy was just how normalized racism had become. So much so that when Oak Creek happened, it was devastating, it was demoralizing, but for many it wasn't a shock. On the day of the massacre in Oak Creek, I remember watching the news, imagining the gunfire in the Gurdwara, in the Divan Hall, imagining the aunties and uncles, the children caught in the gunfire, imagining the violence taking place inside of a space of worship. And I felt myself transported to how I felt when I was 20 years old, watching the towers fall and listening to news of hate violence break out across the country. I felt despair, I felt hopelessness, I felt helplessness. I remember the phone rang and a Sikh friend told me, look, nothing has changed. In 11 years of working, of organizing, of trying to educate and heal our nation, nothing has changed. And I was about to agree with him when the phone kept ringing, and they were my Christian friends, my Muslim friends, my Jewish friends, my LGBT friends, my African American and Latino friends. People from all different colors and faiths were reaching out to me personally to tell me that they were with us. And this happened across the country. There was an outpouring of love and support that the Sikh community had never experienced before from all corners of this country, so much so that the president himself expressed his solidarity, asked for the flags to be lowered to half-mast. In more than 100 years of living and working in this country, it was the first time the Sikh community entered national attention. It was the first time we stood in the national spotlight. It took a butchering for it to happen. But it was a moment when the kind of love and support that was expressed was something that made Sikhs feel like they too were seen as fellow Americans. The Sikh community, working with partners in the civil rights and interfaith world, mobilized for 10 months to ask the FBI to track hate crimes against our communities. And I'm really proud to say that Groundswell at Auburn Seminary helped orchestrate the support of the interfaith community to show the Sikh community that they weren't alone. And after 10 months of work, the FBI finally agreed to track hate crimes against these communities. It's a historic victory. It's been a victory that has been deeply felt, not just by the Sikh community, but the South Asian community writ large. It feels to us that we are finally being recognized, that our struggles with hate crimes as a community are finally being addressed fully by the resources of the US federal government. Now that the Sikh community has won this victory with the FBI, the next step is to launch a campaign asking the US military to open its doors to turban Sikhs to serve. Just as African Americans had to fight to end segregated military units, just as women had to fight to end combat restrictions, just as LGBT folks had to fight to end Don't Ask, Don't Tell, the Sikh community is now fighting to end a discriminatory policy that the US military has upheld for a number of years, forbidding people with visible articles of faith from serving. I think the strongest way to signal to the wider American public that Sikh Americans are equal Americans, that they come from a history of service, including military service, is to make sure that they are allowed to serve in the ranks of their fellow Americans in the military. And so no matter what opinion people hold about the military, I believe this is a campaign that is deeply important as a matter of fundamental equality and human dignity. I'm very proud by the way the nation responded and the community responded to Oak Creek. And yet, I remain disappointed that a year later, when you ask an average American, they understand Aurora, they understand Newtown, but most Americans, when you say Oak Creek, have a look of confusion. Oak Creek as a moment, as a tragedy, and as a story of hope has not penetrated national consciousness in the ways that we all had hoped. And I think this is a grave mistake. I think that Oak Creek belongs to a call to action to respond to gun violence prevention in this country. But Oak Creek is also different from Aurora and Newtown because it came from a moment of hate. It was the largest hate-based mass shooting in recent US history. And so in a moment when our nation is deeply divided over race, I think Oak Creek holds up a model for how our nation can heal, how our nation can have intelligent and insightful and honest conversations about race and hate in America, and about how we as communities can mobilize for change in ways that don't further demonize people who disagree with us, but show them through our stories how change is possible, why change must be necessary in the wake of such violence. And so my hope on the one-year anniversary is that people who want to hold up Oak Creek in our national narrative take action, that you come out and join the Sikh community on our days of service, that you attend a Gurdwara service on that Sunday, August 4th, that you join one of the many runs that are being held by Sikh youth in cities across the nation, that you find some ways, however small, to show that you too remember Oak Creek, not just as a tragic moment, but as a moment that can teach us as a nation how to respond to tragedy.